Hello and welcome to the latest in QCOS's series on grant and tender writing. This webinar is focused on Skilling Queenslanders for Work, or SKU, and particularly on the budgeting and financial management of tender applications. While we are looking at Skilling Queenslanders for Work today, the principles and the strategies that we talk about are relevant across a great many grant and tender processes. Before we get started, I want to thank the Department of Employment, Small Business and Training, or DESBT. You might also hear me refer to it as the department through this webinar. DESBT are the funder for the Skilling Queenslanders for Work grants, and they also convene the panels that approve applications. I also want to extend our thanks to BDO. BDO staff very generously donated their time as we were developing the content for this presentation, and they gave us a lot of useful tips and insights into common areas where budgeting and for grants and things can go wrong. And they also made sure that what we were telling you today was accurate. So really appreciate that very valuable donation of time and knowledge from BDO. Of course, before we get into the content of the workshop itself, I want to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land I'm coming to you from. Those are the Yagara and Turrbal peoples. QCOS is located in beautiful Meanjin, Brisbane, in the southeast corner. I also have the very great luck and privilege of living on Yagara and Turrbal land. And I want to both personally and on behalf of QCOS as an organisation acknowledge the continuing connections to and care for the land and waterways in this area, and acknowledge elders past and present. So for today, we are focused on, as I said, some of those challenging areas of budgeting and financial management for grant and tender writers. Our hope is that by the end of this hour, you'll have a better understanding of the function of budgets and other financial details in grant applications and why they're important, and why funders and the assessment panels are so interested in what you have to say when it comes to the dollars and cents. You're also going to get a whole lot of strategies for developing more accurate budgets and forecasts. And we're also going to look at how you can demonstrate your ability to manage things financially by making full use of the budgeting part of the application process. So we're going to really quickly have a look at financial management for grants and tenders in general before we go through the different budget items for the Skilling Queenslanders for Work budget itself. We're going to then look at some common mistakes in budgeting and, importantly, how to avoid them. And finally, we'll have a quick look at what reporting and acquittal processes look like if you do get a SKU grant. As we go through all of these things, you're going to notice that they sort of circle around several really key principles or things that funders are looking for in your budget response. So one of the key points is value for money, and it's really important that this isn't confused with coming in at the lowest possible cost. In fact, underselling or underbidding, I suppose, for the kind of project that you want to run tells the assessor that you may not have a really accurate understanding of the environment that you're operating in or what is really needed to run your project. Instead, they're looking for you to have a really realistic sense of what this is going to cost, that everything that you've costed and included is among the eligible costs under the program. And that you've got some detail in there about the partnerships and in-kind contributions that are going to add value beyond what DESBT invests if your project is successful. So let's get started on financial management for grants and tenders itself. Now, obviously, financial management is a much bigger topic, and your organisation will have a whole lot of policies and procedures and processes, and possibly even a whole team who have an area of responsibility around financial management in general. We're focusing on it just in terms of grants and tenders here. So what does financial management look like when it comes to grants and tenders? Well, for one thing, it looks like having a really broad and deep sense of what the likely costs and expenditures are for the type of work that you're doing. And we will have some tips as we go along through this workshop to help you broaden the types of expenses that you consider. It means having a sense of your capacity to manage financial and reporting responsibilities if you get the grant. So that can be things like having appropriate account keeping software, having either internally or being able to contract for the kinds of guidance and checks that you might need in that sort of area. Things that you have learnt and capacities you've developed through managing money previously, whether that's small grants or large grants or recurrent funding, all of those sorts of things. Financial management also means having all of your partners and contributors on the same page when it comes to finances. So it means that anyone within your organisation who has any authorisation to make expenditures from your SKU fund knows the necessary approvals and delegations that are there. They know what sort of records that they need to keep, and also when things need to be provided to whoever is in charge of the reporting so that they can get all that formal paperwork done and back to the funder in time. What will really help with financial management in general is if you're able to spend some time thinking about these things and also doing some troubleshooting before you put your budget together. So you might learn from challenges in managing funds before. You might look at your organisation's records for financial management in general or grant acquittals in particular, and see if there are any sort of problems you can identify, and maybe low estimates in some areas of budgets where you can see really clear overspends in the actual acquittal. You might have a chat to teammates or people in similar organisations or running similar programs about challenges they've come across, and think about how you could reduce those risks in advance, and think through how you're going to actually manage the paperwork and the paper trail. Things like whether your account keeping software allows you to really quickly extract SKU expenditure in particular, because that can get really complicated. Of course, as an organisation, you're really unlikely to have SKU as your only source of funding, your only program expense. And when it comes to reporting on SKU expenditure, you need to be really clear in those records that you extract that it is only SKU related expenses you're extracting. So having software and someone able to use the software to do that. All of those sorts of things, thinking in advance about them, can really help avoid some of those common issues. A really key part of this is forecasting. So this is, you know, as with a weather forecast, casting forward into the future and making predictions about what's likely to happen. Now, when it comes to budgeting, there are two key areas of forecasting, and those are inputs and outputs. Now, luckily for SKU as a project, your input is fairly simple. It is just really your SKU grant. Now, you will have a few other inputs, technically speaking, like in-kind contributions, but for the purposes of developing your budget and your expenditure plans, your input is just your SKU grant there. Unfortunately, your output forecasting is much, much more complex than that. It requires you to think about the full range of expenses that you might have, and also consider how those expenses might change either before you start delivery or once you have started delivery. So let's look at a couple of examples of where thinking might undermine that accurate forecasting. And one really common area for this is wages and on costs. So when we get to the actual budget items themselves, you'll see that one of the budget items is called staff wages. And this, of course, is a really common item to have in a grant or a tender application budget. The challenge is if you just think about wages, you're going to really seriously underestimate how much you need to expend in this area, because there are all sorts of costs associated with employing someone that aren't the wages. So any of those non-wage costs of employment are what we would call on costs. And these are things like superannuation contributions, additional insurances or insurance amounts that you have to have as you bring on new staff, those sorts of things. So when you're thinking about staff wages, don't just figure out what you need to pay your workers in terms of that hourly rate for the delivery of the project, but make sure that if you're not really experienced in this area and managing the finances around employment, that you have a chat with someone who is, an accountant, the financial officer in your organisation, your treasurer, someone who has that expertise and can help you nut out what all of those on costs are likely to be for your particular project. So the other area where things can get really tricky here is if increases in costs over time aren't factored in. Now, if you are, say, thinking about putting in an application this round for SKU and then starting delivery, say, in 5 months' time, and then that delivery is going to be over 3 months or 6 months or a year, you're going to have a whole lot of those things that you're costing out in your budget increase in cost in that time. So if we go back to the example of wages, we might have a scheduled award increase or two in that period. Or we might have a staff member who is expected to go up an increment within their award band in that time. There might be an increase to the super guarantee, all those sorts of things. And of course, it's not news to anyone that costs are going up across the whole range of resources and things in the economy. So think as well about if you need to rent a training space and you've got a quote for a certain amount if you were to start renting it now. Well, is that likely to increase above that quoted amount if you start the rental agreement in 5 months or in 9 months? So you want to be, as you're forecasting, thinking not just about what things cost now, but what they're likely to cost when you actually go to deliver. Of course, you can't predict any of these things with 100% accuracy, and there are things that you just can't predict at all. They may or may not happen. They may or may not be disruptive when they do. So we need to think about what we can't predict but might happen, and then how we'll manage that. And this is really when we think about that financial management, some of these possibilities can be a real area of weakness, I suppose. So think about, say you're running a program that has an outdoor component. Maybe you're training your participants in conservation or landscaping, or perhaps you have outdoor adventure-based training activities. Now, if it's Queensland and it's summer, chances are you're going to have some summer storms just disrupt some of those things. Maybe there's going to be flooding that disrupts them for some time. You know, in other areas, you might be looking at fires that could be potentially disruptive, or they could prevent you getting to and from your training activities or your support activities, for example. Similarly, your organisation is likely to have some kind of turnover in the time between applying for a grant and wrapping up a project. If that extends over, you know, more than a few months, we know that workforce turnover is really, really common. So we need to think about what happens if someone who's involved in the rollout of this project then leaves, and maybe it's expected and there's heaps of time for a really good handover, and that's obviously the ideal. But what if someone gets really ill unexpectedly or is unexpectedly injured and they need to be replaced, but they don't have any capacity to do a handover? You know, maybe you need to do some really rushed recruitment, and of course there are costs associated with that. So as you're doing your forecasting, think about those things that you know will be costs you incur, and you know whether those are likely to increase or have associated costs you might not have thought about. And then also think about those things that may not occur, but you need to be prepared in case they do. Now, sometimes you simply can't prepare, and there's not a way to manage those unexpected occurrences except to expend a lot more than you expected. And in that case, you need to be getting in touch with the department as soon as you possibly can once you identify that there's an issue, because chances are you will need to apply for a contract variation to change those budgeted amounts. And if you're not in touch with the department and getting permission for that, you could find yourself liable for covering those costs organisationally, which is, of course, a really serious problem if those costs are quite big. So as you're doing your forecasting, as I mentioned, there's no way to get it 100% correct, but there are a whole lot of things that you can do to increase the accuracy of that forecasting and your likelihood of identifying potential problems. So in general, the more time and effort and input you get into this process, the more accurate your forecasting and therefore your budget is likely to be. A really critical thing here is going to be to get the expertise and the experience of other people into your considerations. So you might have a senior staff member or volunteer, maybe a governance body member involved as you start putting your budget estimates together, and also have those upper levels of management or governance body giving input and review throughout the process. You might have external peers or experts you can consult with who have experience at managing grant budgets or managing projects similar to the one that you're delivering, who can use the knowledge that they've gained over time to help you identify potential problems that you can then troubleshoot that you wouldn't have been able to identify on your own. You might find, for example, that your CEO or the CEO of a local organisation has heaps of experience dealing with grants, and they've got years and years worth of observations of the challenges that can come with budgeting that they're happy to have a chat with you about, and you can then use that experience to improve the accuracy of your forecasting. And I really encourage you in particular to have a chat, if you can, with other people who are running a similar project. So if you are applying for a SKU grant and you're planning on running a Get Set for Work program, see if you can have a chat with another provider of a Get Set for Work program. You know, you can find a list of all of the providers on the DESBT website. And in the community sector, people are often more than happy to have a bit of a chat and share their learning when they've got time to do that. In addition to that sort of consulting and external input, there are things that you can do within your organisation that can help you think beyond what you originally considered. So things like reviewing previous project reports, especially when they include details of planned budgets and actual expenditure, can help you identify potential challenges. You can review the expenses for the programs and projects that your organisation is currently running. You can look at the reports provided when projects finish, and even in some cases from other organisations, not just your own. You might approach one who is happy to share their project reporting, or find some online that have, you know, useful indicators of potential problems. And I also really encourage you to think about this from a risk management approach. And what we do in risk management is we think not just about how likely something is to occur, but how serious the consequences would be if it did. So you can think about, for example, say your administration budget is actually really small. You don't have a lot that needs to that you need to fund in that area. Well, if it turns out that one of those small costs was underestimated by a few percent, that might not be such a big deal. Maybe you don't need to do too much sort of heavy thinking about how you would manage that. But a 1 or 2% difference, or especially if it's a low estimate in terms of something like your staff wages, it could be tens of thousands or at least thousands of dollars, and really difficult to recover from. So once you figure out what is going to have more serious consequences if it happens, you can sort of use that to tailor the amount of time you spend planning something and how much research you do about what likely changes and costs will occur, and those sorts of things. All right, let's start on looking at the actual budget itself. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is built around the budget for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, but you'll see similar sort of structures and processes in all sorts of grant and tender applications. Now, say before we go into this, the link on this slide is for the SKU guide to applying for funding, and I thoroughly encourage you to download this and have it right next to you, right on your screen as you are trying to figure out what your expenses are going to be and then cost them out. It's a comprehensive guide. It's got heaps of really valuable information about what costs are eligible and what aren't, and can help you avoid some of those common problems in developing budgets for grants and tenders. And before we go through the budget items in detail, I will let you know there's one thing missing from this list, or you might identify that there's something missing from this list if you're familiar with SKU, and those are the fees that cover the training itself. So in most cases, a SKU project will be a partnership between a community-based organisation and a registered training organisation, or RTO, that's providing nationally recognised training, or what's sometimes called accredited training. If you are delivering nationally recognised training, you must be in partnership with an RTO or be an RTO yourself. And there will be fees for that training that go to the RTO. And that is not included in this part of the budget, although it is technically part of the budget. Those fees should be pretty simple for you to figure out, because the RTO must have a publicly advertised price for any training they're going to deliver through SKU, and the price for the SKU training must be the same as the price that they would otherwise charge for that particular qualification. So besides that, we have 4 major areas of cost, and then the management fee. Now, the management fee is pretty simple to deal with, so I'm not going to go through that in much detail. The key thing to know is that it is a maximum of 5% of your total project cost, up to $15,000. So with those 2 notes out of the way, let's have a chat through each of these budget items in a bit more detail. The first item, as I already said it was, is the staff wages component. And the key thing here is to remember that this is in fact not just the wages, but also the on-costs. So how do you work out what budget amount to put in this budget item? So the first thing to do is to break it down into different line items. So if you think about the budget item being an overall umbrella, and then you've got a whole lot of specific items underneath that, and the amounts for all of those items will total the amount for the budget item. So the staff wages budget item is going to be made up of specific wage details for the role, each of the roles involved in rolling out the project, and then associated on costs. To work out the wages, it's a matter of figuring out how many hours each role or each person involved in delivery is going to be performing, that is SKU specific, each week. And then simply multiplying the number of hours a week by the award level wage for that person and the weeks that they will be spending in the project. The award wage should be something that you have readily available. If it is and one of the regular sort of awards, and you pay at the award level, you can search the name of the award online, and the government has documents that detail all of those. If you have above award conditions for your organisation, then just look into that with the finance or operations person at your organisation. Now, if you don't have people currently on staff who are going to be involved in rolling out the project, you can use the award wage that you will be advertising the relevant position at to get an estimate of what that person's wage costs will be once they're on board. You need to then think, of course, about what all of those on costs are. So thinking about things like the superannuation guarantee, additional insurances, etc. And you also need to be thinking about likely increases in either wages or those on costs over the delivery period. Now, note that the wages that you're claiming here, the costs that you're adding up, can only be that worker time that is dedicated to SKU itself. It can't be for organisational or recurrent wages. Our second budget item is administration costs. Now, this has things that really easily come to mind, at least for me, when I think about administration, like the admin, office supplies and consumables, but it also includes some things that I don't always consider part of administration. So things like transport hire or room rental, utilities, those sorts of things. But that's where all of these sit for your SKU costs. So you need to think about all of these things, or most of these things, not just in terms of how much are you going to spend on them, but how much are you going to spend on them that is specific to SKU alone? Because as I mentioned earlier, it's really unlikely that SKU is the only project that your organisation runs, that it's the only source of funding your organisation has. And you will then, of course, have all sorts of other administration costs that you can't necessarily readily separate out from SKU. So things like utility costs, you're not likely to be setting up in an internet connection for your organisation that is specific to SKU itself, or a set up electricity that only goes to the rooms where SKU is happening. Instead, you need to be figuring out what proportion of utility costs or consumables or those sorts of things is going to be dedicated to SKU itself. Then there are some other things that are probably going to be much more obvious. So, for example, you can have you can include in your budget items like the cost of the rental for a vehicle that will be used specifically for SKU. And as long as you're only using it for SKU, it would be the full cost of that you could apply for. And things like promotions, advertising for SKU specifically might be much more easily separated from other expenses if you're promoting other programs at different times. Now, in addition to that complexity of teasing out how much you're actually spending on SKU or likely to be spending on SKU, there are also quite a few excluded or ineligible items that you need to be aware of when it comes to the administration budget item. So things that you cannot include in your SKU budget include routine operational expenses, of rent at your own organisational premises, whether that is the use of a space that your organisation owns or would be renting regardless of whether or not you get the SKU funding. There is no funding available for interstate travel or training or conferences for project staff. And there is no scope here for items that should be provided by the RTO. So if you'll remember, I said that those student fees are not one of the budget items that we're discussing today because they are set by the RTO and determined in advance in that way. Now, the way that RTOs work is that student fees should cover things like all of the learning and assessment materials. So if the RTO comes back to you and says that you need to be asking for some funding for those things in administration costs, you just need to have a chat with them about what is expected of them, and that includes that they will provide all of those materials under the student fee rather than them being fundable through any other part of the budget. Now, materials and equipment is another one of these ones that has quite a few exclusions you need to be aware of, and areas where things can get a little bit complex. So this is the budget item that is where all of those resources you need to carry out the project and its training activities go, provided they're not those ones that the RTO is supposed to provide itself. And that might be all sorts of costs that could vary depending on the type of training that you're running. And this is where having a really solid understanding of your training area, but also the needs of your particular participants is going to be really essential. And the way that the budget works in this section is going to be really, really different between different types of projects. So as you're thinking about all of the items that you need to cost out to support the training delivery there. You need to be really mindful too that there are a whole lot of things you cannot claim for under SKU funding. And in particular, when it comes to materials and equipment, you cannot include assets or capital equipment purchases. So this means that there's no funding available for the purchase of motor vehicles, electronic equipment like computers, laptops, printers, photocopiers, phones, tablets, those sorts of things. You can't get office furniture or equipment here. So be really mindful while you're nutting out what you need, and be double checking whether it's eligible, whether it belongs in the budget, and particularly whether it belongs under this line item. And I just can't stress strongly enough how important it is that you go to that guide to applying for funding, especially for this third budget item, to check that anything you're popping in your budget here really is well and truly eligible. So our fourth budget item here is a bit of a catch-all for other costs. Now, this is where any non-accredited training that you're providing as part of your program is costed. So remembering that any nationally recognised or accredited training that's provided by the RTO is a completely separate part of the budget. Here, think about things that you are providing in addition to that. So perhaps you have, in addition to running through the RTO, a certificate in retail, you are also delivering a bespoke program of communication skill development for your participants. Then that's something you would cost through this part of your budget. Similarly, if there's training you want to provide and it doesn't happen to be on the priority skills list, this is where you would cost it. Now, the priority skills list, if you're not familiar, is a government list of those areas of vocational skills that are, as the name suggests, considered priorities. And they're ones where the government offers some kind of subsidy to the relevant training. If it happens that you want to deliver something that is an accredited or nationally recognised training program, but it's not on the priority skills list, again, it goes in this budget item. But perhaps the biggest component for this budget item that you will find is the supports and other activities. So we often refer to this as wraparound supports. So when we discuss the sort of more, I guess, those things that make SKU a more supportive and facilitative process than most training or job preparation programs, it's those wraparound supports that really make the difference. And that they vary so widely, but really common ones that we will see in SKU projects will be supporting people to get driver training, to pay for licensing, both for, cars and driver's licenses, but also specific kinds of licenses. Say they need a white card or a security license, that sort of thing. If you will be covering the costs or partially covering the costs of those things for your participants as part of the wraparound supports that you offer, this is where you cost them out. Another really key component of wraparound supports in most SKU programs is some kind of personal support provision, whether that is counselling, case management, family intervention, engaging with youth workers, group workers, cultural support workers, that sort of thing. So unless that's being provided in kind, as long as it is something that you are applying for funding to provide, it goes in this budget item here. Other things include really practical things that will help address particular barriers to engaging in training or going on to work. So, for example, if you know that a lot of the people in your participant group don't tend to have a good breakfast or lunch, maybe you provide those things as part of your wraparound supports. Or similarly, and this is quite common, that people don't have the appropriate clothing to wear to job interviews, especially where that is expensive, or they can't afford the right uniform or the PPE for actually undertaking work once they get it. Those are all things that you might consider providing as part of your wraparound supports. And again, this is the budget item that you enter them in. Now, it's really important here that we also talk about in-kind supports, and this does get a little bit confusing, so bear with me. If you're not familiar with in-kind supports, that's just the name for those additional resources or supports that you as an organisation or a partner organisation are providing to the participants, but are not costed through the budget. They're not funded as part of the grant. And there is an expectation for Skilling Queenslanders for Work that the organisation, the lead community organisation or their partner organisations provide a significant proportion of in-kind support for participants. So say, for example, you're running a Get Set for Work program, and you know that for a whole lot of the young people who come through your program, self-esteem will be a really big issue. And it happens you have a team of youth workers in your organisation who are funded through recurrent program funding. And under that recurrent program funding, they will run an 8-session group with a 2-hour, and 2-hour sessions each week for 8 weeks as a group support for building self-esteem. Now, rather than asking for funding through SKU to run that group, they're going to be covering it through the usual program service delivery. And in some budget applications for grants, you're not expected to cost out the value of that, but for SKU you are. So DESBT really wants to see at least a ballpark valuation for each of the in-kind supports that you or your partner organisations are providing. And you go about getting that ballpark estimate just the same way you would for any other estimate. So in my example with having a couple of youth workers who are going to run a group, we work that out just the same way as we work out the wages that we are applying for funding to pay. So multiply the number of hours dedicated to the task by the award wage of each person involved and the number of weeks that they will be working those hours, and you get a ballpark valuation for that in-kind support. Similarly, say there's a community centre down the road, and they have a minibus that they don't use on Tuesdays, and they're happy for you to use the bus. That's their in-kind contribution. So when you do Tuesday activities, you've got a bus there ready to take your participants out for adventure learning or industry visits or whatever your training or additional activities are. Now, the value of that donation is simply what the community organisation would charge if they were renting the bus out for the day. And similarly, if you're providing some transport and your organisation is funding that yourself, you might think about the costs of the fuel and maintenance associated with that transport use while you use fleet vehicles, those sorts of things. The important thing here to remember is that for DESBT, although not for all other funders, it's really important to get an approximate valuation of those in-kind supports and include that information in your budget, even though you are not actually asking them to fund it. So provide those valuations, but also remember not to include those amounts as you're totaling up your budget ask. I do apologise that that's a bit of a confusing one there, but if you have any concerns about it at all, you're not sure you're doing things correctly, just get in touch with your regional DESBT office and they're more than happy to talk you through the details of these things. All right, let's move on to some common mistakes and how to avoid them. Now, number one is something I've already mentioned, which is including ineligible costs in the budget. And this is really important because it goes to your how reliable the assessor thinks you are as a potential recipient of funding. And if you've got ineligible costs in your budget, it suggests to the funder that you haven't been sufficiently careful or thorough in developing your understanding of the funding or developing your idea of the costs associated with it. You haven't been entirely comprehensive in your reading, or you've missed a trick putting things together, and that is not the impression you want to give the funder. So instead, you want to be double and triple checking that everything you've included is eligible. And again, it's just going to that guide to applying for funding. My suggestion would also be to get someone who hasn't been involved in writing the budget to sit down with that guide and tick off all of your items, double checking that they are all eligible. Remember that our main sort of budget items are those wages and on costs, there's administration costs, the materials and equipment and the other costs. So you've got a comprehensive list of what is and isn't eligible in that guide to applying for funding. Your management fee must be no more than 5% or up to $15,000 so 5% of the total amount of funding you're asking for, and no greater than $15,000, regardless of that, whether that is at the 5% level or lower. And remember as well that you're putting those in-kind contributions into the budget and you're valuing them, but you're not actually asking for them to be funded. Remember too that those things that should be covered by or provided by the RTO under that student fee shouldn't be appearing in any other budget line items. They're not eligible for funding under any of those budget items at all. Mistake number 2 is having budget items that are too vague, and this might happen because you've got an overall valuation for the budget item without breaking that down into more detailed line items. So that's a pretty simple fix, although it can take a bit of time. It's just about really being clear about all of those things that you are going to be spending that money on, and having each different type of expense broken up into its own line within that overall budget item. So for example, rather than saying, you know, oh, I'm going to be spending $20,000 on administration, you need to really break that down. So maybe your consumables you expect to be about $1,700, a few $100s for printing, some rent not for your own premises but for an external premises that you need to rent so that you can undertake the training or a specific type of activity, you know, and keep going with all of the different items that make up that overall budget item for administration. Add lines to the budget if you need to. More detail is better. And the assessors absolutely must see that detail to know whether your budget asks are reasonable, and they will be comparing what you're asking for with a sort of general or ballpark sense of how much different items should cost and how much it's reasonable for your type of project to spend in a given area. Provide quotes, estimates or workings wherever you can. So you can attach quotes. So I could say I'd had a quote for that $10,500 in rent for the training room that another organisation owns that I want to use each week. I would simply have the quoted amount in the budget, but in the notes section of the line where I've written rent, I would specify exactly what the rent cost was for. So for the rent of a training room for X number of hours, and see attached quote and then the name of the document that the quote could be seen in. So if the assessor wanted to double check that amount or get other details, they know that there's an attached document that has everything they need in it. Now, a related problem, which is one that comes up every round, is that someone will put in a budget that includes line items that aren't mentioned or very clearly connected to any of the delivery activities that they've mentioned in their other assessment criteria responses. So say I haven't mentioned that one of the wraparound supports I'm going to provide is a lunch each day that my participants are in training, but then I have a line item for lunches. Well, the assessor is not going to be very clear on why I'm asking for basically food money if I haven't said and that would be in response to the assistance strategies criteria for SKU, that I'm going to be providing lunches. Similarly, or I guess well, it's really the opposite issue. If I've said in my assistance strategies that I'm going to be providing lunches, I need to make sure I've got a line item in my budget where I'm asking for the funding for that. Otherwise, I'm saying I'm going to provide something, and if I do get the funding, it's not going to include a cost for that, and my organisation is going to have to cover that. Now, it's not just the assessors that having really clear budget items helps. You are actually doing yourself a favour if you're clear about this too. It really helps with the acquittal process and with budget tracking sort of between when you start the project and when you do the acquittal. You can be really clearly seeing as you log your expenditure where areas look like they're tracking really well and where there may be problems. And if you do notice any problems, say things in one area are much more expensive than you expected, you need to get onto DESBT about that variation of contract as soon as possible. The other thing is there is the possibility that the person responsible for leading the project and managing the budget will leave your organisation or will have to have some time away from work during the project period. And if you have this very detailed budget, then the person who picks up responsibility for that will have the clarity that they need to be able to run that properly. And if you have vague budget items, that sort of clarity just isn't there. So our final common trap that people fall into, and it's surprising how often this happens, is that the budget literally doesn't add up. Now, the budget total, so the total amount that you are asking for, needs to be reflective of each of those individual line items that you have costed. And it might not seem that common that these things wouldn't add up, but they don't. And sometimes they're many, many thousands of dollars out. So if you are anything like me, you will want to have at least 2 different ways that you're checking that your budget line items do all add up to the total. I really suggest not only adding it up a few different ways yourself, but then getting someone else to do their sums and see if they come to the same amount. And if there are any differences between those total amounts, then you know that something is skewed. Another option is to use your built-in sort of calculation process in, say, an Excel spreadsheet or budgeting software, accountancy software. You can often use formulas or features or tools within those to tot up the totals in a particular column, that sort of thing. I like to, when I am adding up things like this, to add up all of the line items just in one go and note what the total is, and then separate everything into those overall budget items. So those are those umbrella items I talked about earlier. And for each budget item, get a subtotal made up of all the line items within it. And I then would add up all of those budget item subtotals and make sure that that total is the same as the total of all the line items that I grabbed earlier. And again, if those don't add up, which quite often they don't because we make some kind of mistake in calculation, that's a really good prompt to go back and look at things again. But importantly, really do get someone else to have a look at these things and add things up. It's astonishing how easy it is to make mistakes with this particular process, but it's also really quite simple to make sure you're not making those mistakes as well. It just takes that little bit of time. All right, we're almost at the end now, and I want to have a quick look at reporting and acquittal before we finish up. So acquittal is basically just detailing what you've spent, and in a way that it can be very easily compared against the budgeted amounts that you have. Now, in the case of SKU programs, DESBT again makes this really easy for you. They actually provide a bespoke acquittal template with the services agreement once the funding has been approved. And they input those budget item amounts into your acquittal agreement, and you can really clearly then see which items have which amounts associated with them, and you can use that then to as a gauge as you start expending those funds to make sure that you're not going to go over in any of those areas, or highlight where there is a real challenge and you need to quickly get onto DESBT to talk about whether you need a contract variation. Now, there are more than one acquittal. There is more than one acquittal for most SKU projects. Most often the SKU funding will be split. So you might put in one interim acquittal in the middle of your delivery. So after you've received sort of one batch of funding, and you do an acquittal showing how you've spent that, and you must put in the acquittal before you get the next batch of funding. But all SKU projects, regardless of their length, will have a final acquittal, and that goes in along with your final reports, the written reports and the spreadsheet that you do for DESBT. This is what the acquittal template looks like. So as you can see, it's quite simple. It just, in this case, doesn't have the amounts put in because each project budget, of course, is going to be different. As you go about expending your funding for SKU, it is really important that you're noting each area of expenditure as well, so that you can then record it against the relevant budget item. So that's something to be really careful about. If you, for example, make some administrative purchases or pay some bills, but you're not noting in your accountancy software that those are associated with the administration budget item, that's going to get much, much harder and be much more work when it comes to putting the acquittal together, as you're trying to figure out which budget item the different receipts relate to. So do yourself a favour and make sure that your account keeping software helps you enter that sort of detail when you are including the information about expenses, and then makes it really easy to pull out all of the relevant expenses when you go to put the acquittal together. Obviously, the intention is that the approved budget and the actual expenditure are the same. It's not expected that they will be dollar perfect. As we talked about earlier, there is no way to get an absolutely perfectly forecasted budget, but we do really want our actual expenditure to be largely in line with those approved budget amounts. And be mindful that if you have really overspent in one area, you may not be allowed, or you may not be reimbursed by the department. And even if you've underspent in another area and you think, oh, that's okay, because I can just take the money from the underspent area and put it into the overspent area, that's not the way it works with grant funding. So you really do need to be getting in touch with DESBT as soon as you know that there is a problem, so that you can get that approval for the alteration in your budget. And that is the only way you can make sure that you won't either have some of those funds clawed back and you won't be having to reimburse them, or that you won't receive the funds after the expenditure. Because the way this works is that you make the expenditures, and then at some time afterwards you get the funding come in, and there are organisations that have had quite large amounts that they will not be reimbursed or have to give back, because there has been a problem with that, well, a lack of agreement, I suppose, between the approved budget and the actual expenditure. Now, on the acquittal itself, this is a formal document, and your CEO or the equivalent, so say your general manager, that sort of thing, the person with the ultimate responsibility for the organisation, I suppose, has to sign it. But in many cases, there will need to be additional steps as well. So for a SKU grant that is between $100,000 and $500,000, it is both the CEO or equivalent who has to sign it, and the organisation's accountant. And then for any grants that are over $500,000 and absolutely any project that involves a work skills traineeship, there needs to be a full audit report. Now, a full audit report is an audited financial statement with an accompanying full transaction list. If your organisation regularly gets projects acquitted in this way, you can sometimes sort of bundle them and you send everything you need an acquittal for off to the accountant at the same time and just detail the different projects that you need, or you might do that at the same time as you are sending off your financials to the auditor before your AGM. Either way, you must get that full report done. As I said, if it's over $500,000 in funding or involves any amount of funding for a work skills traineeship, you do need to have that full audit report. All right, that is our whirlwind tour of funding, financial management and budgeting for SKU. Just a few of those key points again for you. The SKU budget is made up of a series of different budget items, and there are lots of ways that things get tricky with those budget items, but if you put in a little bit of time and effort, you can pretty safely avoid most of those common problems. The things that are going to be really, really important are being detailed, providing notes and quotes and costings and workings wherever you can to help the assessor see exactly what it is you intend on spending. Making sure that you are double and triple checking that you are only putting those eligible costs in and that your costs all add up to what they need to, and keeping your costs in a reasonable and cost-effective sort of range. So not aiming for the lowest possible cost, and certainly don't make your life harder for yourself by underestimating what your costs are going to be. Rest assured that the DESBT assessors have a really strong sense of what it generally costs to run the kinds of projects that SKU applicants like to run. So they have a realistic idea there. They're looking to see that you have a realistic understanding of what it means to put together and deliver a project in this area. Once again, I wish you the very, very best of luck with your application. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to us at QCOS, or if it's a technical question about SKU, I recommend that you have a chat with your regional DESBT office. We meet a lot of the SKU program DESBT staff in the course of our work here at QCOS, and they are all super keen to have a chat to applicants before those applications go in. And of course, thanks to DESBT and again to BDO. It's been really interesting to have a little bit of extra time to talk about budgeting and finances, because for those of you who've been to our tender writing workshops, budgeting and finances are always part of what we discuss, but we don't have the time to go into them in much depth. So I hope you found this useful. And I hope to hear from you if your grant application is successful, or if you have any suggestions for how QCOS can make our tender writing resources more useful to you. All right, good luck. Bye, everyone.